The famous Got Milk advertising campaign for the California Milk Processing Board was based on a key insight, and that was the idea that milk is an irreplaceable accompaniment to some foods. In other words, if you have Oreo cookies, you can't have them without milk. If you have a peanut butter sandwich, you can't have it with milk, and it's pretty tough to think of cereal without milk. So based on that insight, which came up in research, the California Milk Processing Board developed an advertising campaign that was all about what would the world look like if you didn't have milk with a peanut butter sandwich, for example. And so it ended up being quite funny and got a lot of attention, and it turned around milk consumption. But where did they get that insight from? As I mentioned, they got it from research, right? So in other words, people said that milk was an accompaniment to some foods, and they couldn't think of having Oreo cookies without milk. But they said a lot of other things too, right? They would have said hundreds, if not thousands of things in the course of that research. So how did the Milk Processing Board just pull that nugget out of the research, and how did they actually use it and turn it around to turn it into a famous and compelling advertising campaign? That's what this lecture is about. It's about mining the data that you have collected for insight. And we do that through by analyzing design research, by synthesizing it, and in particular, by using the power of stories and storytelling. So let's begin with this. Just to define some things, right? Analysis, you may be familiar with as a concept. We analyze data all the time. And what we're doing is really trying to understand things as they are now when we analyze. So we break things down into their components, and we compare those, and we look at what is causing what, who is doing what, etc. All of that stuff is data. And what we're doing with it is analyzing it to come to some conclusions. What we do then is we then synthesize that into a model of what is actually going on. So like our mental model of the sort of underlying causes of things and the real dynamics that are happening in society and in the world. And from there, we go over to the top right of this matrix, and we think about, okay, well, here's what is, or so what we think what is. How can we develop a model of what could be, what might be the future? And then we start to manifest that in terms of design and ideas and prototypes and so on. But the starting point is analyzing and synthesizing, and that's what we're doing here in this lecture. Synthesizing then is trying to find that bigger picture, that model that describes everything. So just as an important tip, before you start collecting data, you should be thinking about how you're going to analyze it. So one is to decide in broad terms what you're looking for. Sometimes you don't know what you're looking for, and it's good to know that you don't know. But at least if you can get some parameters around what it is that you're looking for in order to develop your ideas. Plan the analysis in advance, right? So are you going to be doing inductive, i.e. from the ground up? Are you going to be doing top-down analysis where you've got some ideas and you're trying to see examples of how those ideas work in practice? And what kind of methods are you going to use? We'll talk about methods towards the end of this lecture. And then allow time. You should be allowing at least a day for analysis of each day of fieldwork. You want your analysis really to help you understand or to represent the story that the user is telling. And we do that by taking actual quotes extracts, coding them, and clustering them into themes. And this is the way that ethnographers work. Designers work in a slightly simpler way, which I'll describe in a moment, but it's important to start with this. And that's really, first thing is getting really familiar with your data. If you've got transcripts, reading them over and over again, coding it, assigning codes, searching for patterns in those codes, and then coming up with themes and defining and naming them before you produce your report. I'll show you how that actually works with an example. So here's an interview. And this is about streaming services. So the interviewer asks the interviewee, whose name is Peter, So how did you find something? And Peter says, well, first she looked at HBO, suggested that we watch Silicon Valley, but I'm not really into comedy shows. So then she went into Netflix and suggested different movies, but there wasn't really anything I felt like. But then I remembered that we'd been watching Better Call Saul before the summer holiday, and I couldn't really remember if we'd watched all the episodes. So we looked it up, and it turned out that we had stopped in the middle of the season. So that's what we watched. And so here I've just highlighted at random some things that might be considered codes. HBO and Netflix, they could be one code or they could be two, depending on whether you're looking at the industry as a whole or whether you're looking at specific competitors within it. And then the remembering is an interesting code as well, and I've highlighted that in green. And you can see those are the codes, and you would go through the entire interview. This is just an extract. And you'd highlight those in the appropriate color so that then you can see, you know, how often they occur, and you can start clustering them together at the end of the, as you've gone through it. You can take all the green highlighted things and pop them out and put them in one document, for example. But the themes that are coming out here are streaming services. The HBO and Netflix are streaming services, and decision-making, right? So remembering is one way of decision-making, or it's one factor in decision-making. So you can see how these are sort of higher level concepts. Now, as I mentioned, that's the formal way we would do it in ethnography. In design teams, we often simplify that. And what we do in a team is to share stories, and then from those stories we derive themes, and those in turn develop insights. There are three phases to this process. One is single case analysis, the next is multiple case analysis, and the third part of that is sense making. Single case analysis, storytelling, listening, and note-taking. Multiple case analysis, it's grouping things into themes, labeling the themes, and then sense making. We're actually using some design methods like user personas, journey maps, and so on. We'll talk about those. Let's start with single case analysis. So what each interviewer, or if you've interviewed in pairs, you could do this together. And what you do is tell the stories that you heard or the stories that you observed. As you're doing that, the rest of the team listens and take notes. So what you're doing, so those who are talking, share the details of the interview or the observation session. You've got to do this in as much rich detail as you can. Details really matter here. Stick to the facts. Talk about things that surprised you. Talk about things that might have been what you expected. Get as close as you can to the actual words that were used. Use quotes as much as you can. Also think about body language and what was communicated non-verbally. Think about what was going on around in the context and the situation. All of this is data. Those of you who are listening, then you listen carefully, write a sticky note, one piece of information per sticky note for each interesting piece of information. And then if you're doing this live, then you'd have somebody in the team collect the sticky notes and put them on the wall in no order for now. Obviously, if you're doing this online, you can just pop them straight up there. Change this role for each interview so that then you get you move from one person talking about their interview and observation, then the next one and the next one, and you sort of change the roles around. Important tip here: don't start by setting up labels and then trying to fill in the sticky notes afterwards, because what you're doing is you're going to force fit the data to some pre-decided themes. So let the data speak. So what you'll do is just put them in no order, and in the next stage you're going to cluster them. Multiple case analysis, then what you're going to do is cluster the stickies into common themes, look at them, see what's similar to what, move them around so that similar ideas are together in a cluster, and keep doing it until you've clustered everything. Now, I wouldn't just stop at one pass here, because what you'll do at first is you'll put the obvious stuff together, right? You'll put, for instance, if you're doing coffee shops, you'll put taste of the coffee, the music, and so on. But as you go through, you may see that there's some unconventional connections between some of these. And if you really work with those unconventional connections, you can get to some pretty interesting places. So I would encourage you to do this once, take a break, go back and see if you can do it in a different way to see what insights you can turn up. And so then sense making. So what you're going to do now is label the clusters, right? So what you're going to do is look at the clusters and ask yourself, why did you actually group these notes together? What was going on here? Is there a compelling label you can give for each one? And you call that a theme from your research. What insights then, as a result of that, did you get from it? Maybe you're not seeing much. Maybe it all looks very obvious. Okay, then try again. Try it a different way. Use a model like some of the ones we'll discuss: empathy mapping, user journeys, etc., to see if something is coming out that makes sense and is interesting for you. Ultimately, what you want to do is to be able to make generalizations, and those would be, for instance, descriptions of market segments, types of people, and how does decision making work. For example, in grocery shopping, there will be people who always make a list. There are people who never make a list, and there are people who make a list and ignore it, people who get their husband or wife to make a list and then they do the shopping, and so on. So there, around a behavior like list making, you can develop market segments, and those would be of interest to a grocery shop, for example. What might be the similarities or differences between segments? For instance, are all the people who make lists, are they accountants, or maybe they're not? Maybe they're artists. So, or maybe they're people on a budget who really have to watch what they're spending. So, what's revealing here about how the segments are similar or different? What might be some hypotheses about causal relationships, right? Does being on a budget make you much more careful about spending, and therefore mean you are making a list and you're sticking to it? Or is it just a function of the kind of personality or individual you are? What you're looking for here, the term used in ethnography is thick description. So you're looking for details that have meaning, right? So as you, for instance, we'll stick with the grocery shopping example. As you watch people grocery shopping, and you see somebody going through and they're checking things off as they go, right? That's a detail, and that might be meaningful, so you take note of it. Ultimately, what you are looking for, though, is meaning and insight, and so you should be always watching for this. This isn't a process where you do everything and then you just assess it, although there is an assessment step to it. It is like constantly thinking, what's going on here? What makes me curious? What surprises me? And what insights can I get out of this? Making sense, though, means looking deeper. What are the inconsistencies? What might happen that needs explanation? Maybe you see something that really puzzles you when you're out looking at grocery stores. Maybe you've got people who've got 2 or 3 lists going on. Well, what are those lists, and why do they have 2 or 3 lists? Maybe they're shopping for more than one person, or maybe they've categorized them in some interesting way. Is there a difference between what people say and what they do? For instance, if they say they always recycle and you find they're throwing a lot of stuff in the garbage, that's a revelatory, or it's revelatory and it's a personal interpretation, but they may have an explanation for that, right? They may know, for instance, that in their area, certain types of things are not recyclable and have to go into the garbage. Is there a cultural context? Is there something specifically cultural? If you look, for instance, at flowers, there are a lot of cultural things around the kinds of flowers that you give on certain occasions, right? White flowers in some cultures, for instance, are associated with death, and so then you probably don't want to give those to your mother-in-law. Metaphors. How is the experience kind of symbolic of something bigger, right? So, just sticking with flowers, flowers are loaded with symbolism. So when you give flowers, it actually matters what kinds of flowers you give and how you give them in the occasions. And those are sort of metaphors for your love, for example. So that's a big thing that's going on here. So we've talked about some of the broad principles and approaches, and I'm going to give you a couple of methods. There are many methods you could use for this, but a couple of the more commonly used ones are going to follow here. One of those is user personas, and that is taking an ideal type. So this is not an actual person, but it is an ideal type of person who would be representative of a market segment or a segment of users. What you would do is find a photo, write a story about them, importantly, write their goals. What are they trying to accomplish? And then you can encapsulate everything about them with a quote, something they would say. This is what this would look like. This is what I wrote for Ryanair, which is a discounted airline in Europe, based in Ireland. And this is Brendan, and I made up Brendan, right? So, but again, this is based on research about Ryanair passengers. Air travel is a ripoff, Brendan would say. Working people deserve better. And so then it tells a bit of a story in a couple of paragraphs how Brendan at 24, he moved from Ireland to England to get into the construction trade, to join his brother. He loves it there. He's got a girlfriend. They go to the pub and to a movie every now and again. But it also talks about the difficulties that he's facing. And one of the difficulties is that he's not earning an awful lot of money. And so he wants to make sure that he's stretching his money as far as he can. He also tries to stay in touch with Ireland. So his priorities, having fun and saving money. And there are certain goals he has around his life, being a good son, making ends meet and sending money home, getting home for the holidays, which is important from a Ryanair perspective, and going back home to live one day. And then his values, again, encapsulating who he is. An honest day's work earns an honest day's pay. That's what a persona would look like, and it's an essential tool if you want to get inside your user's head and heart and really to understand how they view the experience and how it works for them. You might also try using user journeys, and that is kind of mapping their process of going through an experience, a particular service experience, to tell their story. Although you could use it for products and for interfaces as well, right? So think of your persona, think of Brendan or whoever it is, going through an experience like the airline travel experience. What is happening, right? Who's involved and how do they feel? So that then, and that's about uncovering the truth, charting what this all looks like, telling the story, and using your map. I'll give you an approach that I use for this. It's a sort of two-phase approach, and I think you'll find it useful. Starting with the 5 E's of experience: enticement, entry, engagement, exit, and extension. So these are the phases you would go through from the very point at which, from Brendan might go through, from the very point at which he thinks of traveling, to going to the airport, interacting with the ticket agents, to being on the flight, to leaving, and then what happens afterwards as he's in touch with Ryanair, or they send him promotions and that sort of stuff. And so down the left there, you've got what happens, who's involved, thoughts, feelings, and actions. So you could use this by popping it up on a whiteboard and then populating each of the boxes with sticky notes. So you get a sense of what's really going on and breaking it down into its components. That can ultimately turn into a user journey. Now, this is a fairly complex one that is done for the Natural History Museum, but it'll give you a sense of what this is all about. So along the top are some of the guiding principles, and these kind of emerge as you're doing it, right? So things like on the second from the left there, exploring the website is only one part of people's larger end goal of visiting the museum. And you can see that as you sort of play out the journey, that it's, if the museum asked you to look at the website, they're only asking you to look at part of the problem. So identify the stages of the typical customer journey. The 5 E's really are just guideposts. So you may well find that one or more of those break into sub-segments, or you might want to leave a section out altogether, or leave one of the E's out altogether. In the case of the Natural History Museum, the stages are research and planning, shopping for tickets, booking, pre-arrival, arrival, and then post-arrival. And then then a lot of this is taken up then with the actual journey model, with the experiences. So these are on the left here are the Natural History Museum, doing, thinking, feeling, and experience at the bottom. So, describing the experience in some way. You can do that with happy faces or smiley faces and sad faces and so on. That's another way a lot of people do it. And within these areas, then you actually show what's happening, so people can get the nature of the experience at a glance. If it looks like this kind of never-ending loop that you can never get out of, That's important information, right? So representing that graphically is a great way for people to see what's going on. And then as you do this, as you're developing this, you start to develop some of the key opportunities. You start to see the pain points. You start to see where things are really working well and where you want to enhance that, right? So as I said, this is a fairly complex one. Google user journeys, and you'll get many, many examples of these. Many of them are simpler than this, but depending on your goals, you may want either simpler or complex journey mapping in order to help you work through things. Synthesis is all about stepping back and assessing what you have. So if you step back from your user journey map, what's the overall pattern here? What's it telling you? Take a broad look at it. Is there a pattern here? Are there pain points? Are there pleasure points? Are there other experiences that are like this? What is going on an airline like going to a museum? In what ways might it be? If you sort of use unconventional analogies like that, you might get insights that you wouldn't otherwise get. What really are the critical things that this quality of this experience depends on? And then how might the whole experience be improved for the user you're designing for, or for people like him or her? There are definitely pitfalls to all this. One of those is that you may actually get overwhelmed. You're likely to, because there's a ton of data a lot of the time. My recommendation there is break things down into small pieces, and take lots of breaks, right? So go back, review what you've got, then see what you can add in. You may have difficulty figuring out what's important. Right? So how would you find? How would you know, for example, among all the other things, that doing milk accompanying other foods is an important point. The idea there is try and look for connections between the things you've heard, look for connections between themes, and see if there's an underlying bigger story going on. And the bigger story for the California Milk Processing Board was, yeah, first of all, milk is essential, and secondly, people tend to run out of it a lot. And so if you can start reminding people that they're about to run out of a very essential commodity, then you have the potential to increase consumption, which is what they did. You will have biases, confirmation bias, the classic one, and you're going to be looking for evidence that confirms what you already know or think you know. So look for contradictory evidence, look for evidence that actually suggests you might be wrong in this. And you may well pay attention to a single participant. You can find a very charismatic participant or somebody who's got compelling ideas and they seem a little ahead of everybody else. I would talk that through with the other members of your team. That participant may be very significant or they may not. And that's something that you as a team will have to judge. Some things to remember, as I mentioned, plan the analysis before you do the fieldwork so you know what you're going to be doing later. Use storytelling, have lots and lots of sticky notes ready, which you can do on a whiteboard like Miro. Look at individual cases and then for patterns across cases. And then from there, you can make sense of all that you're seeing. And then look through take the time, look through the data through several different lenses, take a break, do it again, and see with different methods, start using empathy maps, rose thorn bud. There's all kinds of methods out there that will sort of help you just get a different perspective on things and get you to that aha moment where you've got an insight. Just some things to leave you with. Given what you know now about the process of analysis, what form should the data you get be brought to in your next team's analysis session? Photos, audio files, videos. Maybe you need to bring actual products with you. For instance, if aroma matters a lot, if you're doing coffee, bring a bag of coffee beans, whatever form that you think makes the most sense. User personas. I would say, what's the usefulness of user personas, and combine it with the next one. Aside from user personas and journey maps, think about some other tools, right? That might be useful to you in sense making. Remember that the whole point of this is to get to that moment where you say, yeah, this is what's really resonating. This is where there's real potential for innovation. And you'll find if you do that all of that work that you've done will really come together and it will click for you.